All right, guys. My name is Todd Gable, and it's my pleasure to introduce you today to our guest, Jason Clemens. Jason is the Executive Vice President of the Fraser Institute. It's Canada's leading think tank, an organization that I am still associated with. Jason and I have been colleagues for a number of years. Jason is an expert on American fiscal policy, Canadian fiscal policy, and a host of other things. He's been incredibly influential in my life in matters of political philosophy and economic thought. All right. And so today he's going to talk to us at least a little bit about some of the fiscal challenges facing the United States and to what extent can us, America, learn from Canada in terms of policy solutions. So with that, I give you Jason Clemens.
First, my thanks to Todd and Mike for inviting me down and hosting me. It's a pleasure to be here at James Buchanan's alma mater. So this is no doubt a prestigious podium at which to talk. So what Todd asked me to talk about tonight is what are the lessons that the United States can learn from Canada from a very pronounced period of change in Canada's history. Indeed, my colleagues and I wrote a book called The Canadian Century a few years ago where we argued that the Canada of 1989, by the year 2000, just did not exist anymore because of all the changes that our country went through. Now, I can certainly talk about some things about Canada, which I'm sure everybody in this room is interested in, particularly given hockey season right now. Yes, most provinces in Canada, you can start drinking legally at 19, which means really 16 or 17 is a legal drinking age. Okay, we have two people very excited to come up to Canada. This is not actually what I'm going to talk about. What I'm going to try to focus on, as I say, is a reform period in Canada. Now, before I get started, I want to give you a premise about how the institute that I run, our philosophy about economics. I know most of you are economics students. We were influenced quite greatly by Milton Friedman when we were started in 1974. At that time, Milton, and throughout his life, said that there's no such thing as a Republican economist or a Democrat economist. And there's no such thing as a liberal economist or a conservative economist. There are good economists and there are bad economists. And good economists focus on measurement. And so our motto at the Fraser Institute is if it matters, measure it. And so what I'm going to bombard you with is a whole lot of data this evening. And Todd will make my slides available if you actually want to get into those slides. Or you can certainly email me if you want the data or the slides themselves. So let me just give you an outline of what we're going to do. First, I'm going to give a quick overview of the State of the Union of the United States, which, to put it bluntly, is pretty bad. The U.S. has some very serious fiscal problems. I'll then talk about Canada and where we were in the early 1990s, which looks a lot like where the U.S. is right now. I'll talk about what we did in the early to mid-1990s, and then we'll talk a bit about welfare reform and education, and then hopefully we'll have lots of time for Q&A. So first, let's talk about the state of the United States. So first thing, you are borrowing a whole lot of money. So this chart shows you the amount you're borrowing at the federal level each year as a share of your economy. Okay, so how much debt are you piling up each year as a share of GDP? Starts from 1975, goes to 2025. Now, why did I put up pictures of President Clinton and Newt Gingrich? The reason for that is those green bars are projections forward. That's the Congressional Budget Office. It's their best guess about what's going to happen in the future. Economists are not good at forecasting. In fact, God put us on this planet to make weather people look good in terms of our ability to forecast. Now, the only way those forecasts are going to come true is if the United States returns to the policies that were in place under Bill Clinton and the Republican Congress, which if you start doing the probabilities that you're going to get that kind of a president and that kind of a Congress in the next 10 years, I'm willing to take that bet. So what I would do is look at that green future as the best case scenario, absolute best case scenario. You get a great president focused on practical solutions. You get a Congress that's willing to work with that president over the next 10 years, which again, you certainly don't have that right now. And whether or not you get that in 2016 or 2020, I would doubt. Now, in terms of those deficits, just if you think about your own household, If you're borrowing every year and you're spending more than you bring in every year, it means your debt's going to pile up. So this shows you the amount of debt that the federal government of the United States has as a share of the economy. So 47.7% was the peak under Bill Clinton. It then went down quite a bit, almost to 25%. It now stands at 72%. Again, if you assume policies like Bill Clinton and Newt Gingrich had, you see a slight dip in the debt to GDP ratio, which again is just total stock of debt compared to the size of your economy, and then it starts to increase in 2021. Now, one of the measures that's important here, which I'm sure any of you who have a credit card know, is when you accumulate debt, you have to pay something called interest on that debt. Now, if you're the federal government, in fact, if you're any government, if you're paying interest on debt, it means you're not spending that money on healthcare or education or defense, Social Security, what have you. Okay, so it's a wedge between the money you're bringing in and the money that you can actually spend on actual programs. So this data is two things. It's the dollar value of the interest, which according to CBO, the United States will spend about $825 billion on interest. That's a lot of money for the government not to be spending on healthcare, education, defense, Social Security, the other things the federal government does. Now, more importantly and more realistically is what's called the CBO's long-term assessment. Okay, this is an assessment out to 2085. So in those previous charts I showed you green, it's about an 8-year forecast to the future, and it's very rosy, very optimistic. This projection by the CBO, I think, is much more realistic. Some may say pessimistic, I'll say realistic. It is a very ugly picture. This is their projection on how much debt relative to the size of the economy of the United States is expected to accumulate. 245% of debt. That means by the end of this period in 2085, the United States federal government will have accumulated enough debt to consume the entirety of your economy for 2.5 years. That's a heck of a lot of debt to accumulate. In fact, there's some literature that says anything above about 80 or 90% is a problem. Now, there's two main drivers that are explaining this accumulation of debt in the United States. One is your healthcare system, Medicaid and Medicare, the public system. The second explanation is Social Security. So, in part, if the United States is going to get a handle on these deficits in debt, it's really fundamentally going to have to come to grips with those two programs, the healthcare programs and Social Security. So not surprisingly, when you have that kind of a debt accumulation, what does that mean? It means you're spending more than you're bringing in. Really easy. Red line is what you're spending. Blue line is what you're bringing in. The red bars at the bottom are how much you're borrowing. That means every year, the federal government right now, looking forward, its best guess is that the U.S. federal government is not going to bring in enough revenue to cover what it's spending, and it's going to have to borrow. This is borrowing done by adults now that will be imposed on the young people in this room. It's the borrowing that you will do as an adult that will be passed on to your children if you have children. So the key here, for those who like public finance, the U.S. is in a pretty serious what we call structural deficit. That means irrespective of how the economy is doing, you're spending more than you're bringing in revenue, which means you have to borrow. Okay. Now, all of these shows are all these shows are American, but they are certainly of the era of the 1990s. So I want to talk to you now, and I want you to keep in mind those charts I just showed you, because there's a lot of similarities between what my country, Canada, went through and what the U.S. is going through right now. Okay, and so if you look at 1961 to 1993, blue line is revenues, red line is spending. So we had a long period, in fact, we have a history in my country of balancing our books. We moved away from that beginning in the early 1960s, and we started spending a lot more money than we were bringing in. In this chart, spending goes from about 15% of our economy to about 23%. So more than a 50% increase in the size of our government at the federal level. Now, not surprising, when you're going to spend more than you have an income, you're going to borrow a lot. Okay, so these are the size of the deficits every year from 1966 through to 1993. and that's as a share of the economy, right? So what we're doing is looking at the size of borrowing relative to the size of our economy. Okay, and many of those deficits are actually larger than the deficits the U.S. Was incurring in 2008, 2009, 2010. Particularly if you look at the early 1980s, Canada was incurring very large deficits, above 8% of our economy. Fairly large deficits, which again, when you're accumulating deficits, right? Deficits are, I'm spending more in any particular year than I'm bringing in revenue. When you're doing that, you're going to accumulate debt. So here I've shown you the 10 provinces. I know everybody in this room can name the 10 Canadian provinces. No, okay? These are the deficits for the 10 Canadian provinces as well as the federal government in 1992-93. I gave you 1992-93 because that's really the year before things start to unfold in Canada in terms of reform and changes to government spending and even government regulations. So in terms of the deficit, federal government had 5.5%, which is larger than the federal deficit right now. Alberta, Ontario, and some of what we call the Atlantic provinces, which are bordering your New England states, also had fairly large deficits in that period. Again, debt. So if you're borrowing every year, the total amount of debt that you're going to have is going to increase. We went from 18% size of our debt relative to our economy in the mid-1970s to 67% in 1994, just before we implemented the reforms. Remember what I said the federal government debt is now. It's about 72%. So very close in terms of the run-up we experienced in our federal debt relative to the run-up that the United States has experienced over the last few years. This is the size of debt for all of our provinces. Unlike U.S. states, our Canadian provinces can borrow as much as they want, or as much as the capital markets, that is lenders, will allow them to borrow. 48 of the 50 states have restrictions on how much they can borrow. So if we look at the debt for the provinces and we put the federal debt down to the provinces to ask, well, how much do citizens in each of those provinces owe in total through their government? The lowest level was about 82%. The highest was up at almost 120%. Again, above what the United States is now, but certainly lower than where we think the United States is going in the near future. Now, here's the real bite, and this is one of the things that really motivated change in Canada, and this is interest costs. So again, if you think about your own credit card bill, this isn't spending you're doing on textbooks or your rent or what have you. This is spending that you're doing just to pay on spending you did in the past that you borrowed. So this is interest cost on debt. Now, for those of you, I want you to think about your own budget. 1974, 10 cents of every dollar that our federal government got went to interest costs. Now that's high, but I think you can manage that. Now I want you to think about your personal budget. If for every $10 you got, I was taking $3.40 from that. In other words, I was taking 1/3 of your revenue away just to pay your interest. That makes it pretty difficult for you, A, to balance your budget because you have your rent, your car, your Friday night study group. I did go to university. I know what studying. I told my parents I studied on Friday. It's pretty hard to cover those expenses when you're losing 1/3 of the revenue you bring in from a part-time job or what have you, just to paying the interest on your debt. This was a major catalyst for Canada to change. Now, in terms of total government spending, so this is local, provincial, or state in the United States, and federal government spending. We went from being very close to the United States in the mid-1960s, about 30% of both of our economies were represented by government. In other words, of the total economy, about 30% was spent or represented by government. We went up to 53%, and you see that departure. The red line's Canada, the blue line's the United States. You see this growing gap between the size and the prominence of government in Canada versus the size and prominence of government in the United States. And then actually, if you look back, we have data to the founding of our country in 1867. Canada has traditionally actually had a smaller government than the United States. Post-World War I, we start to look very similar to the United States. mid-1960s, we have this break where we become a much larger government country than the United States. So a real run-up, again, from about 30% to 53% of our economy was represented by government spending. Now, that lays the groundwork for a pretty incredible period in Canadian history. I doubt anybody knows anybody up there. The middle one on the top is the Prime Minister, Jean Chrétien. The one to his left, your right, is Paul Martin, Minister of Finance. These gentlemen undertook enormous change in our government. And again, part of the hypothesis in the book that we did was the Canada of the late 1980s, early 1990s just does not exist if you fast forward to the 2000s because of all the changes that our country went through. And these gentlemen of all political stripes, we have many liberals, which would be the equivalent of your Democratic Party, several conservatives, which is the equivalent of your Republican Party, and we have at least one socialist. On the bottom right, Roy Romano was the premier of a province just above the Dakotas, and he was the premier of a socialist party. So of all political stripes, coming together in a pronounced period of change in Canada. So why did we get that change? There's a number of explanations. One of the most important that's overlooked is the people who were lending my country, our country, money, started getting worried. Started getting worried about the amount of debt that we had accumulated and our ability to pay it back. And so interest rates started increasing. In fact, in 1 year, interest rates went from 3.6% to just over 8%, which is a real run-up in the short-term debt markets, which shows and was illustrating the kind of risk people were attaching to Canadian debt. You had a famous Wall Street Journal article that started to call the Canadian dollar the Northern Peso. That woke up a lot of people. A lot of folks started taking a look at the Canadian dollar and the risks associated with the Canadian dollar. Polls in Canada started shifting when it came to deficits and debt. We started seeing more and more people across the political spectrum worrying about deficits and debt. We had an opposition party in the federal government that was quite principled and quite focused on the need to balance our budget. And critically, and I think one of the most important lessons for the United States is the first government in Canada to really deal with its deficit and debt was a socialist party. So in other words, the first government in Canada that actually cut spending and moved to a balanced budget and started to bring down its debt was not a conservative, it wasn't even a centrist party, it was a left-of-center party. That allowed a platform for other parties and other political stripes in other provinces to undertake similar reforms. So that basket of incidents, concerns, worries, events is what created an environment for pretty profound change in Canada. Famously, a left-of-center finance minister, the first quote is one of my favorite, which said, "It's a new vision of government. It's a smaller vision for government, but a smarter vision." And this is what drove the reforms. It wasn't just about less spending, because certainly, as I'll show you in a moment, all governments cut spending. But it was about getting smarter spending. So yes, we're going to spend less, but we got to spend it smarter. And that was a theme that we saw for at least five years or so in Canada. So here are the actual cuts. I was honored enough to work in the United States for 3.5 years a couple years ago. And so when Canadians say cut, we actually mean cut. Like we actually mean if you had $10 this year, you have less than 10, like 9 or 9.50 or 8. Somehow in the United States, in the economics profession, a reduction in the growth rate, so if you were going to grow like this, and now you're going to grow like this, that's a cut, even though you're still increasing. In Canada, when we say we cut spending, we cut spending. So federal government cut spending by almost 10%. Alberta cut spending by almost 22%. Saskatchewan, which was a socialist party at the time, cut spending by 9%. These are real reductions in spending. Real reductions in health spending, real reductions in K-12 education, real reductions in university spending, real cuts, not reductions in the growth rate. Now, critically, and one of the things misunderstood by a whole lot of folks is the time. So in this table, what I've shown you is the actual reduction in spending and the number of years that it was done under. So as you can see, everybody cut either in 2 or 3 years. So it didn't take us 5 or 10 years to get out of the mess we were in. We're talking about 2 to 3 difficult years. And I wouldn't underestimate how difficult they were. They were. Contracts were undone with civil service and the public sector generally. Cuts to transfers were made. It was a difficult time. I think the benefits of that far outweigh the costs, but it was a difficult time for the country as a whole. And again, it wasn't just the federal government. This was the federal government in Canada and all 10 provinces reducing spending to move to a balanced budget. So if we look at the federal government as an example of what happened, blue line is revenue, red line is program spending. You can see program spending goes down by about 5 percentage points of the economy. That's a marked reduction in real spending that the federal government was doing. Now, when your revenues are essentially flat with a slight decline if you throw a regression line through, but let's just say flat for the time being, and you're reducing spending at the pace we were, it's not hard to realize what's going to happen. We moved from bleeding red ink every year and borrowing in the capital markets to running surpluses. So for over 8 years, what we were able to do federally in Canada is stop borrowing. So the amount of revenue we were bringing in was more than what we were spending, and we were using that extra money to start to pay down debt. So what happens, not surprisingly, is if your economy is growing, you stop borrowing and you start paying down your debt. It's pretty simple, the math, right? Your debt is going to go down quite markedly. And so in a very short time period, our debt went from 67% of our economy down to 28%. We certainly have more to do, but that is a marked reduction in the burden that our federal government's debt had on both the federal government itself, but more importantly, the Canadian economy. Now, I talked to you about the wedge, that interest wedge, about coming in between the money we were bringing in and what we could actually spend on programs. Again, we see a marked decline. 35.2 was the peak, down to 12.8%. That means more money for healthcare, more money for education, more money for defense, or heaven forbid, more money for tax cuts. At the very least, what it means is our country was spending less money paying interest on past debt. And so we had more resources to spend on existing programs, or as I say, on tax cuts. We also narrowed the gap with the United States and returned to what was a longer-term average for us, which was a size of government that was close to the United States. So we went from a little over half of our economy being represented by government spending, down to about 40%, which in 2008 was very close to the United States. We were within 1 percentage point of the US. In other words, if you looked at the totality of the economy, the size of our government in Canada was very close to the size of government in the United States in terms of spending. Now, there's no disagreement that 2009, 2010, 2011, that both lines go up as the governments react to a pretty severe recession, particularly here in the United States. We weathered it much better. But the gap has remained fairly small. That is, the size of government in Canada and the United States now is much more comparable than it was between the 1965 all the way to about 2007. Now, critically, what we started doing in 1997 in Canada is cutting taxes, particularly supply-side taxes. I don't know how many of you have covered that in your econ classes yet. What our government did when they started to cut taxes is focus on improving incentives and competitiveness. That was the 2 pillars of tax relief. How do we make Canada more competitive so we can attract entrepreneurs, we can attract business investment, we can attract folks who want to expand or build businesses, we can attract high-skilled labor. That was how we wanted to cut taxes. We cut capital gains tax twice. We cut corporate income taxes. We went from 28% in the corporate income tax rate, which was one of the highest at the time in the industrial world, to 15%, which is now one of the lowest in the industrialized world. So when we cut taxes, what we focused on was getting incentives better, or improving incentives, and getting more competitive. What we worried less about was taking from high income earners and giving to low income. Okay, so we didn't use the tax cuts to a great extent to redistribute income. What the tax cuts in the 1990s worried about was how do we get more income? And this is an important debate in the United States because you're in the middle of this debate about whether you should worry about growing your economy or redistributing what's already here. For us in the 1990s, to a large extent, we worried about growing the economy rather than redistributing existing income. Now, I can tell you many of the predictions when this was happening was the Canadian economy was going to go into a slump, that there's no way the Canadian economy could retrench to the extent we were, with governments cutting spending in a 2-year period by 10% and not spiraling into a recession. The reality, however, over the 10-year period is that Canada was the best performer in the G7. So if you look at real GDP growth from 1997, 2008, we outperformed the G7 in every year. And in some cases, we outperformed them by more than double. In other words, our economy was growing at a much stronger rate as we retrenched government relative to the other G7 countries. And none of the other G7 were doing what Canada did to the extent we were. If you look at real per capita income, so the first measure is the total economy. Now this is the total economy by individuals. In most years, again, we're above the G7 average. In some cases, much higher. Yes?
Can you tell us who's in the G7? Some of us may not know.
Oh, on the spot. G7. So Italy, France, Germany, the UK, the United States, Japan. Did I get it right? I got 6? I'm going to say, sorry, and Canada. But we take Canada out from the G7, otherwise we're comparing ourselves to ourselves. So sorry, this comparison is Canada to the other big 6 economies, industrial economies in the world. If you look at job creation, which certainly the US should be interested in right now, given that this is the weakest recovery in terms of job creation, really since the US started recording data. During this period of reform, we were a job creation machine. Canadians, we couldn't find enough people to fill positions. In fact, one of the things Canada had to do during this period was aggressively look outside of Canada, particularly Europe, to bring people in on temporary work visas. So if you look at some of these data, particularly in the recession year 2001, the recovery 2002, 2003, we're up at almost 2.5% growth in jobs when the G7 is basically at 0. A very strong period of job creation in Canada, which in many ways is because of investment, which is the next chart. This just measures Canada's rate of investment relative to the other G7 countries. What were we doing? Canada was attracting lots of investment. And broadly across a lot of sectors, although certainly we benefited from energy and got a lot of energy investment. But when you get that scale of investment, you're going to create jobs. You're going to create increases in income. That was the recipe. Balance the books, get a surplus to finance tax relief, particularly incentive-based tax relief, get competitive again to grow the economy. That recipe is exactly what we observed over that time period. Now, one of the lessons that I think, because it's not just about cutting spending, and that's part of the problem that I observe in Washington right now, which is the debate is, you guys just want to cut spending. It can't just be about cutting spending. It's got to be about spending it smarter. And so what I want to do in the last bit of time I have is talk to you about the welfare reform that Canada underwent versus the United States, and then how we deliver K-12 education versus how the United States delivers K-12 education. So the first one is, we can certainly talk about pension reform. Canada now has solved the equivalent of our Social Security problem. We've solved. Healthcare is a real problem for us, and I hear it's a bit of a problem down here as well. We are also struggling with our healthcare, but certainly on the pension side, we've fixed it. Healthcare we're struggling with, but I'll focus on welfare and K-12 education. So on welfare, we have what's called a natural experiment. The reason we have a natural experiment is that the United States and Canada both reformed welfare in 1996. So one of the big differences between what Canada did and what the United States did is that our federal government really didn't tell the provinces what to do. Our federal government actually said, you know what? The Constitution says it's the province's responsibility. We're going to leave it to you, the provinces, to sort this out. In the United States in 1996, in the Clinton-Gingrich welfare reform, the federal government imposed a whole bunch of conditions on the states in welfare reform. Time limits, work requirements, maintenance of effort, which meant that you had to spend what you were spending before. Our federal government, for example, said to the provinces quite blatantly, if you want to spend more on welfare, that's fine, but you're going to pay the difference. If you want to spend less on welfare, that's fine. You can use the difference on whatever you want. But we are going to give you this transfer, and you are going to worry about welfare. That's a very different approach than the United States. So, in other words, what Canada did was decentralize welfare to the provinces and said, we, the federal government, really aren't going to worry about welfare all that much anymore. We're going to let the provinces worry about it. What the US did is the federal government told the states many of the things they had to do so that you had one policy from Washington dictated to the 50 states. Now, this is part of the cut that I was talking about. This is the social transfer from the federal government in Canada to the provinces. So in the United States, a colleague of mine in Washington estimates that there are 1,100 transfer programs from your federal government to your states. In Canada, we have 3. Now, our 3 tend to be bigger than each of your 1,100. But ours is much more transparent because there's only 3 programs we have to look at. Okay, what I want to focus on is 1996-97, you see a decline. This is the federal government saying to the provinces, we are now going to give you less money for social services and post-secondary education, but we're getting rid of all the restrictions except for one that we impose on you. Okay, so in other words, our federal government said, here's the check. We're going to impose one small regulation. We're getting rid of everything else. You, the provinces, got to figure out welfare. You have to sort out what's going to work for your population in your individual province. Now, what that obviously does is allow for more experimentation because it's not a one-size-fits-all anymore. Now, interestingly, when you actually look at the data, there was 2 common things that happened. Most of the provinces implemented administrative reforms to try to deal with fraud, which in some provinces had become a real problem. Secondly, there was an awareness that welfare benefits have to be in line with the wages that someone can get at a minimum wage job. Because just on an incentive basis, if you pay someone a lot more on welfare than they can get in the labor market earning a minimum wage job, the person's going to sit there and say, well, but I'm better off being on welfare. Now, the problem with that is if you're on welfare, you're not in the labor force. You're not getting labor skills. You're not seeing opportunities in the labor market to move up. And so what all of our provinces became much more informed about and aware of is that they had to balance the welfare benefits someone could get with what they could get in a minimum wage job. Now, in addition to that, though, and more importantly for this discussion of decentralization, is we saw experiments. So some of our provinces implemented workfare, where if you were a single-bodied recipient, so in other words, you weren't married, or particularly you didn't have children, you had to work to get your welfare benefit. In other words, you had to get back into the labor market, at least on a part-time basis. Other provinces said, well, no, we don't want to go that way. My home province, for example, said we want to do time limits. So we want to return welfare to more of an insurance program. Other provinces said, well, in fact, what we want to do is try to get people not to go on welfare in the first place by diverting them to the labor market or to private charities. The key here is we didn't have a one-size-fits-all approach to welfare. We let our provinces experiment with different approaches and learn from one another. And the results were quite stunning, particularly if you compare it in the United States. So the blue is the number of welfare beneficiaries over time. The red is the number of welfare beneficiaries as a percentage of the population. So what do you see on the right-hand side? What do you see as a ratcheting up? And we could go back further into the 60s. You see this consistently. You see every time we have a recession, a step up in the number of welfare, and then as we recover, it flattens. And then the next recession, we get a higher level of welfare, the recovery comes and it flattens. We never saw it coming back down to normal levels. Because what was happening is more and more people were going on welfare and staying on welfare. In fact, at its peak, we had over 10% of our population receiving welfare in one kind or another. 1 in 10, which, if you think about welfare as a long-term income program, you're stuck. You get stuck in dependency. It's very difficult, if not impossible, to make yourself better off. Now, what you see then is in 1995-96, the wave of welfare reforms, you see the line coming down back to its 1970s trend line. Its level. So our welfare rates are now back to where they were in the 1970s. Now, the critical question is what happened to those people. This is, in fact, more important for many of us than the actual percentage. Now, the careful studies that are done of welfare seem to indicate that most people that have gone off welfare are much better off. They're either in training or they're employed in the labor force. Now, there are some groups that we have trouble with. The United States also has trouble with them, and we have to do a better job of sorting out those groups and getting policies that work for them. There are really 4 groups. One is single parents. Single parents have a much higher propensity to get stuck in low income or poverty. Second are people who don't finish high school. Very difficult to get into the labor market, get a good job, and move up if you don't finish high school. Third, which is a very difficult situation, are those who battle with mental disease. The fourth group, which is somewhat related, are those who have drug and alcohol abuse problems. So Canadian social policy, just like US, in fact, I think most industrialized countries are worried about these groups, and we have to do a better job of dealing with those groups. Critically, though, when you look at the welfare data, it was the single employables, right? Single individuals who didn't have kids, who were choosing welfare. Those folks, by and large, have gotten back into the labor force or were into training. And we've done a somewhat decent job on single parents. In fact, I think we've done a much better job than the United States in trying to help single parents get some skilled training and get back into the labor force. So thankfully, most of the data we have in terms of those moving off welfare is that it was beneficial to them. They're at a higher level of income and they're out of the circumstances by and large that we're explaining why they were in welfare. So the key takeaway for you, if there's anything on the welfare discussion, is that Canada, unlike the United States, decentralized. We let the provinces worry about welfare, design welfare, execute, regulate, deliver welfare. Okay, our federal government did not micromanage the provinces. We gave that to the provinces and let them worry about it. I think that's a real lesson for the United States about how to get out of some of the problems that your country faces right now is to decentralize to the states. So along the same lines, let me talk about K-12 education because you see a very stark difference between the two countries. The biggest difference in Canada, we have no federal government involvement in K-12 education. There is no ministry, there is no sub-department, there is no cabinet minister, there was no one in our federal government worried, concerned with, responsible for K-12 education outside of Aboriginal education or First Nations or Indian education. So our federal government just basically has no role in K-12 education. That is completely devolved to the provinces. So let's talk about some of the different approaches to education K-12. British Columbia, which is the province above Washington State, my home province, we have a province-wide voucher program. So if a parent wants to send their child to a private school, the provincial government pays for 50% of the cost of sending your child to that school. We have about 1 in 8 kids in my home province who goes to a private school. If you go to Alberta, Alberta is right above Montana and the Dakotas. It's similar to Texas in its outlook, lots of cowboys and cowgirls. But they also have a province-wide voucher program. Theirs is 60 to 70% of the value. So if you want to send your kids to a private school in Alberta, they pay for 60 to 70% of the cost. They are also the only province to have charter schools. I know many states also have charter schools. Alberta is the only province in Canada to have charter schools. In addition, Alberta pays $1,600 to parents who want to homeschool their kids. So in Alberta, what they've said is we're going to support every type of education: public education, private school education, homeschool education, charter school education. So in Canada, Alberta has the most different types of education provision for K-12 schooling. If we look at Ontario, which is right above Michigan, it's also our industrial heartland in Canada. Ontario has a very different system. Ontario has 5 competing public school systems. So think about that in the district you grew up in. I would venture a guess that most of you grew up in a school district where there was one public school that you went to because it was in your area. So wherever you lived, you had one public school, that's what you went to. In Ontario, you definitely have 2, and you can have up to 5 public schools that you would have chosen from in your area. So in Ontario, instead of relying on a voucher program or charter schools, what Ontario relies on more are competing public schools. So multiple public schools that you don't pay anything for, competing with one another for you to send your children to them. Interestingly, Ontario actually also has an independent school sector, but they get no support from the government. So about 5% of kids in Ontario go to a private school, but parents have to pay the full price. And then Quebec, which is our French-speaking province, they, very much like my home province of British Columbia, have a very large private school sector. About 1 in 8 kids in Quebec goes to a private school, and about 50% of the price to go to a public school, private school, in Quebec, is paid for by the provincial government. So again, a voucher program for the whole province, not just for one city or one school district, gives parents a lot of choice in terms of going to a public school or going to a private school. Now, so I want to talk about 2 things and give you some data. So what this data up here shows is the percentage of kids in each province who go to different types of schools. Now what you'll see is in the one called AB, which is Alberta, SK, which is Saskatchewan, and Ontario, which is ON, you see the green bar. The green bar is religious education that is paid for fully by the province. So if you're in Ontario, Saskatchewan, Alberta, you can go to a Catholic school. If you're in Ontario, you can actually go to an English Catholic school or a French Catholic school, in addition to your English public school and your French public school. So you have a choice of 4 schools, plus, depending on where you live in Ontario or Alberta, you may also have a Protestant school. These are fully funded public schools. So in those 3 provinces, what they've designed is different public schools for parents to choose from. Not one public school that you have to go to because of where you live. Now, if you look at the Atlantic provinces, which are the 4 on this end, NB, NS, PI, and Newfoundland, those systems are largely English public systems. The exception is New Brunswick, which has a fairly large French system. Now, part of that is our own history. Canada is a bilingual country, so many of our provinces provide some level of bilingual education, or French-only education if you're outside of Quebec. Now, to augment that chart, let me go back. So this is choice within the public school system. Now, to augment that, we have private schools that get funding, depending on your province, from the provincial government, which we talked about a bit. So if you're in British Columbia, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, so the 4 on the far right, or Quebec, QC, the government pays for part of your tuition. So in British Columbia and Quebec, 1 in 8 of our students go to an independent school. So this is additional choice, but this is choice outside of the public system. Now, part of what I hope you're getting is that our provinces have delivered choice in different ways. Some of our provinces, like the East Coast provinces, they have much less choice. The remaining 6 provinces have a lot of choice for parents, but they deliver it in different ways. Some have used multiple public systems, some have used independent or private schools, one other has used charter schools. The key here is a much higher level of choice, but again, allowing the provinces to experiment and have different approaches to how they finance and regulate and provide K-12 education. Now, indeed, one of the things that's misunderstood, unfortunately, about independent schools in parts of Canada is the demand. So this actually shows you the growth in independent school enrollment in my home province of British Columbia. So since 1980, the number of kids at an independent or private school has increased by 272%. The number of kids in public schools has increased by 7%. There is a huge demand in British Columbia and Quebec, to a lesser extent Alberta and Saskatchewan, from parents to have their kids attending independent schools or private schools. Now, where this shows up is in wait times and wait lists. We did a major study 2 years ago looking at wait times and wait lists for independent schools. And that's the data in the bottom. So over half of the independent schools in British Columbia have a wait list. These are parents trying to get their kids into a private school, and the private school is full. And basically 80% of the private schools said that's normal. It was normal for them to have a wait list to get into their school. And so one of the things British Columbia and some other provinces have to do is look at how we regulate independent schools to allow them to expand more easily. Right now, unfortunately, we constrain the ability of private schools to expand and deliver more education when parents are asking for that additional education from independent schools. Now, the reason you care, I hope, is because what I'm going to show you now, which is a comparison between K-12 education in Canada and the United States. So first thing, how much does it cost? So in Canada, we spend 3.5% of our economy on K-12 education. The US spends 4.1%. Okay, so US spends more as a share of your economy. You take more of your economic output and devote it to K-12 education than we do. If we look at a per student basis, Canada spends about $8,400 per student. US spends about $11,000 per student. So either as a dollar value or as a share of the economy, the United States spends more than we do on K-12 education. Now, what about test results? Because you spend more, you want to get more. Right? Remember, it's not a bad thing to spend more on healthcare or spend more on education. The question is, what value are you getting? So these are the international tests by the OECD. They're called PISA. So I've given you the math, the reading, and the science. And I've given you 3 scores. Canada's in red. Dark blue is the United States. Light blue is the OECD average. Remember, you're spending more than we do on K-12 education. Okay, so math, you're not close to our score, and you're below the OECD average. Math is on my far right. On your far left, reading, you're slightly above the OECD average, but again, not close to Canada in terms of your reading scores. And then science, you're basically at the OECD average, but again, well below Canada. Okay, this should be of great concern because if you're spending more, but the kids graduating K-12 and taking tests in high school aren't performing at the same level as Canada. Okay, so part of the question is why? Well, what about other results? What about teacher measures? A lot of folks are concerned about teacher-student ratios. Canada has smaller classrooms on average than the United States, even though the United States spends considerably more than we do on K-12 education. Interestingly, though, you have more hours per teacher. The question is, or should be, what is the teacher doing in those extra hours? Because they're not translating into higher test scores. So, in other words, we have smaller classrooms. Our teachers have less hours, though. You have slightly larger classrooms with much more hours, but they're not translating into test scores. So something else is going on in K-12 outside of those test scores. In terms of graduation and employment, we have a fairly higher rate of graduation at 85% versus 76% in the United States. And then employment, ours is 76% versus 71% for those who only graduate high school. Again, in my mind, we've got better outcomes and we're spending less. That's the recipe for value for money. That's the recipe for we're spending less money, but because we're spending it smarter, we're getting better results. And so it's not just about cutting spending and keeping the existing system. It's about cutting spending and reforming the existing system. whether that's welfare or K-12 education or healthcare or Social Security or what have you. So again, if we look at the lessons from K-12, Canada has a much more decentralized approach than the United States. In fact, our federal government doesn't have a role in K-12 outside of Aboriginal education. We leave that to the provinces. That has led to experimentation. It's led to much more flexibility for the provinces to respond to changes in their student population, rather than having a heavy hand of the federal government telling them what to do. It also means, relative to the United States, we spend less, and on the key measures of outcome, we do better or similar to the United States. So, in total, Canada really is not the country we were in the late 1990s. We have changed in terms of the size of our government, the role of our federal government, what we ask the federal government to do for us. We're certainly a much more decentralized country. Our provinces now have a much more pronounced role than they did in the late 80s, early 90s. And we've seen huge benefits from that, whether it's welfare or education, that we have seen less spending or the same amount of spending, but better results, particularly when we compare ourselves to the United States. And so again, as the United States struggles with profound problems, both today, in terms of your deficit, your debt, I think problems in the way that your political system is working, and longer term, when you look at Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, I think there are lessons that the United States can learn from our experience in the 1990s, just as Canada can always learn lessons from the United States. Indeed, one of the frustrations is that whenever countries face problems, they seem to look inward, instead of looking outward and asking what is the logical question, which is, has anybody else gone through this? And can we learn lessons from them? And I think the answer to that is yes. Canada looks and has a very similar history to the United States. And we went through very similar problems that the United States faces today in the 1990s. And I think there are real lessons for the United States to learn, or at least incorporate, as you struggle with fixing these same problems. So again, my thanks to Todd and to MTSU for the invitation tonight. Happy to take any questions.
Yes.
I was kind of,
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm kind of wondering how easily you feel comparing your 3 or the 10 provinces. Do you think that would work easily with 50 states if it was as decentralized?
So, sorry, did everybody get that? Probably not. I'll repeat. Right. So the young lady's question was, how easily can we translate the 10 Canadian provinces and the lessons that they experienced to the United States? So I think there's two answers. The first is, I think the general principle of decentralize to the provinces or to the states and let them act as grown-ups and let them experiment and learn from one another is a good general approach. So I would certainly stand by that. I think where someone could make an argument that it's not apples to apples is if you compare a state like California, for example. So California has more people than the entirety of my country. So is there an issue now in California? Yeah, but what I would say if you were bringing up California is decentralize to the counties, decentralize to the cities if you're in a state like California. So I think the general principle of deliver programs and design programs at the most localized government level possible, I think as a general principle has shown itself to be quite beneficial. And not just in Canada, we have some evidence from Australia and some other federalist countries about the benefits of having a decentralized approach. Now, that said, the key here is to let that experimentation happen. So let California design a system that is going to be very different than, say, North Dakota or South Dakota, which is a very different populated state. Its economy is very different from California. But I think the general lesson is easily transferable from Canada to the United States. Yes, sir.
What opinion do you have of the way that Europe has reacted to the global recession, and like what predictions do you have for the European Union as it's grappling with the Greek debt crisis and problems of government spending largesse in countries like Italy and France and Portugal?
Yeah, so I try not to do forecasting because the reality is we're terrible at forecasting. If I was a great forecaster, and I don't mean this to be any offense, if I was a great forecaster, I'd be on a beach right now reading. I would not be working full time. Now, that said, I think there's a fundamental structural problem in Europe, which is they have a monetary union, but not a fiscal union that's enforced. And when those two things are incongruous, you're going to end up with the problems you're in right now. And the reality is they're not solving that. I think the linchpin here is how long Germany is going to be interested in and continue to support the rest of Europe. I think if we get to a point where Germany starts to scratch their head and say, why exactly are we subsidizing the bad behavior of countries like Italy and Greece and now France, I think that then becomes a real test of the European Union. So my sense, and again, I don't spend a lot of time on Europe, but my sense is they either need to move towards an integrated fiscal and monetary approach, or they need to move to a more decentralized approach. You can't do both simultaneously without having the kind of hiccups that the European Union is struggling with. Yes, sir.
And from what countries and in what ways are America borrowing from other countries, and in what ways are they borrowing from other countries?
So sorry, the gentleman's question is where and how is the U.S. borrowing from other countries? So I assume you mean the federal government. So it's a very interesting question. One of the things that's misunderstood right now, at least my observation, is that there's a discussion in the United States that you're borrowing all this money from China. And you certainly are borrowing money from overseas, and you're certainly borrowing some money from China. Where you are doing most of your borrowing, though, is actually from your Federal Reserve. So last year, John Taylor from Stanford did some work that showed that 43% of the amount of money borrowed by the U.S. federal government was borrowed from the Federal Reserve. That is a recipe for inflation down the road. That is a very dangerous way to finance debt, which is just printing money. And so for those of you who are taking monetary economics or who are doing macro, what you want to ask your professors is, what happens when you monetize debt? What happens when it's not people or corporations or pensions or other folks lending you money, but it's your central bank printing money? That is a very different type of borrowing, and certainly I think there's a number of people, Alan Meltzer, who is probably the dean of monetary policy right now, has expressed concerns for about 2 years now on how the U.S. is financing its debt. If you're interested in this issue, Google Alan Meltzer and federal debt. He has been quite vocal about his concerns about the monetizing of debt in the United States.
How do you spell that?
Meltzer is M-E-L-T-Z-E-R, Alan Meltzer. He's at Carnegie Mellon. And he is, without a doubt, one of the deans of monetary policy.